So welcome everybody to FSR Policy Debates. We wanted to start this year's debate with very, very important issue. Despite all the issues with security of supply and also the war that is ravaging Ukraine, definitely climate change is a big challenge and perhaps the most serious challenge humanity is having. And there are nowadays a way how really to respond quickly to global temperature rise. So that's why the first debate is very much focused on this fast track approach that we could manage on climate. So, and it's strengthened by the, in the last COP26, achieved agreement on Global Methane Pledge, where 30% methane emission reduction could be achieved already by 2030. But it is important now to reflect where are we and where do we need to go. We will start with introduction with my colleague, Professor Jones. Then we move to scientific findings where Daniel Zavala and Manfredi Caltagirone will make their presentation. Then we move to more challenging part, implementing GMP, where Giulia Ferrini from IMEO and Nathan Borgford-Parnell will speak from the climate and the closing remarks will be done by Leone Teodoridou from External Action Service and my colleague Ilaria Conti. So without much hesitation, I am now passing the floor to Professor Jones for the introduction. Christopher, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andris. So just a few words of introduction. The background for today's discussion is obviously the Commission's proposal on methane emissions, which I think we can all agree is making its way far too slowly through the Council and Parliament, but we have to accept there's plenty for them to do at the moment. So it's the first ever such legislative proposal, and hopefully it's a model that others will follow quicker rather than slower. So, I mean, it has two basic frameworks, two basic parts. The first part, a legal framework to ensure that within the EU, we have the highest standards of MRV with obligations to detect and repair leaks, and bans on venting and flaring. But and this is great, absolutely great. But of course, it only applies to production within the EU, which, let's face it, is only going to be a tiny part of the production of emissions of methane emissions, which only going to be a tiny part of the global problem. And so, of course, then the Commission in the second part has to ask, well, how to deal with imports. And that's where the elephant in the room is. And so importers will be required to submit information on how their suppliers perform MRV and mitigate emissions. And most importantly, in this context, the Commission will establish two transparency platforms aimed at showing performance reduction efforts and what companies and countries are doing across the world. And so this is a transparency database and a global monitoring tool. And this is where we get right into the people the folks that have been kind enough to join us today, the International Methane Emissions Observatory and the Climate and Clean Air Action Coalition, because the international emissions, of course, front and center of making this proposal work in practice rather than just on paper. And of course, a lot of people would argue that the Commission's proposal is weak from this perspective, that we would like to see ETS or equivalent-based charges and imports based on the methane emissions contained within natural gas that we import, for example. But of course, before we do that, we have to be able to track and trace and to report and monitor carefully what is happening. And that's a precondition to moving what I'd call the second step. And so that's why what we're going to listen to today is really so important. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing our speakers. So with that, back to you, Andris.
Thank you, Christopher. You kept your promise. So it was really short. And that's why we now immediately could go to discussion. And the first speaker is Daniel Zavala from Environmental Defense Fund. Daniel, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I think you can see my screen. Thanks for the invitation, Andris, Christopher. Thank you so much for the introduction. The idea for this first talk is to very briefly discuss or remind everyone about why we care so much about methane. I think we've heard a lot about this in the past couple of years. And after that, present some of the work that both the Climate and Clean Air Coalition as well as IMEO have taken in terms of using measurements to better understand where the emissions are coming from in a way that mitigation action can be accelerated. This is particularly important, obviously, in the context also, as Christopher was saying, of the EU proposed regulations, but also in terms of the Global Methane Pledge and a number of countries moving ambitiously to significantly cut emissions before the end of the next decade. So as we all know, climate change or global warming is a present tense problem. It's not a future tense problem anymore. Impacts are being felt unequally around the world. In the case of methane, a potent greenhouse gas, we know that more than a quarter of today's warming is happening because of methane emissions. But this is also why ambitious, effective action to cut emissions can significantly reduce the rate at which the planet is warming. Again, this is why the Global Methane Pledge represents such an opportunity to achieve that. In brief terms, I think historically, when we've been thinking about climate change, we usually think about carbon dioxide emissions, a long-lived gas. In a way, when we think about carbon dioxide emissions, we think about how high or how much the planet is going to warm. On the other side, we have the short-lived gases, such as methane or black carbon, which, because of their relatively short lifetime in the atmosphere, but extremely powerful nature, tells us how fast the planet is going to warm. Again, the double-edged sword between the opportunity to significantly reduce emissions and have this window of time for ambitious action in terms of decarbonization. But if we don't take advantage of this window of time, the climate crisis is going to accelerate. What we know from work from the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, the Global Methane Assessment, is that by 2030, a reduction of almost half of global anthropogenic emissions is possible. So we know we can achieve roughly 40 to 45% reduction. And if we implement these measures across sectors, this would translate in roughly avoiding a 1/4 degree Celsius of warming by mid-century and almost 1/2 degree warming by the end of the century. And this is a very big deal. We know that there's a number of measures, readily available technologies that can be implemented across sectors. And we know that in a lot of cases, those measures are significantly cost effective. So they make sense economically. If we take for a second the oil and gas sector, we know that roughly, almost 85% of the global emissions could be reduced. We have the technologies today to do it. And between 50 to 80% of those are economically feasible. So this is one of the reasons why I love the early work in terms of both methane mitigation, but also in terms of understanding the emissions, have started with the fossil fuel sector. Again, there's very clear opportunities across all sectors, but the fossil fuel sector represents this place for, let's say, early wins. So with this context, the importance of methane and the need to move quickly in terms of mitigation, why do we need better data? And it's true that we don't have the time to wait for perfect data. And we know a set of measures that can be implemented today. But it's also important to think how improved data could accelerate this action. Here's a particular example which comes from oil and gas methane emissions data. The chart right now in this slide shows different measurement-based emission estimates. So scientific teams went to major oil and gas production regions like the Permian Basin in the US, or collected enough data about oil and gas methane emissions across the US And they came up with what's called a methane intensity, which is the amount of methane that is escaping to the atmosphere compared to the natural gas production. So when teams have collected this data directly in the fields, they find that roughly for the US, in average, 2.3% of the gas is escaping to the atmosphere. For the Permian Basin, which is one of the major oil and gas producing basins in the world, this is close to 4%. When we compare those measurement-based estimates, either to the inventory-based estimates, for example, from EPA, or to what leading industry are proposing as targets for mitigation, we see a big discrepancy between those numbers, right? So the EPA national emission inventory would be at 1.3, and leading industry targets would point at 0.2%. With this discrepancy between numbers, it's going to be very hard, one, to know where different countries that sign the Global Methane Pledge need to start for effective action. And more importantly, as these mitigation measures take place, we're going to need measurement-based data to track changes in emissions over time and understand if the ambition is being met and it's enough. The good news is that across different spatial scales, there's a number of technologies tested that have been used for more than a decade that can provide very useful information for the different stakeholders that are trying to reduce methane emissions. We have satellites, we have infrared cameras that can pinpoint specific leaks inside facilities. We have sensors mounted on drones, aircraft, cars. All of this, it started, again, because of this early wins within the oil and gas sector, they started being tested to measure and understand emissions from oil and gas production. But now most of these methods have also been applied across other sectors, for example, agricultural waste. So there's this great opportunity to constrain or better characterize anthropogenic methane emissions. And I think the key is in a policy relevant way. It's not about measuring emissions for the sake of measuring, but measuring in a way that where the information can quickly be translated to mitigation actions. And I'll show in a second a few examples of what this actionable policy relevant data means. I mean, we get, when we think about methane emission estimates, we have them at different scales. We have what's reported at the country level, for example, on the inventory submitted to the UNFCCC, but there's other scales at which this data is fundamental to take action. There's cases, for example, at the regional level, where knowing where we have emission hotspots can pinpoint governments for action at specific parts of their country. We also know that it's really at the source level where action is taken, for example, by the asset managers within the oil and gas industry. Thus, understanding the emissions at this very specific equipment source site level is also extremely important to guide mitigation. Again, highlighting the value of empirical or measurement-based data, both to guide mitigation, but also to track progress. Over the past few years, in a very ambitious effort that started with the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, and that now it's being followed by work by the International Methane Emissions Observatory. And those are things we're going to hear more later on by both Manfredi and Nathan. There's a number of international methane studies targeting initially the fossil fuel sector, which is already providing policy relevant data about how much methane is emitted, where it's being emitted, and even some of the causes that can point to solutions. This started with emphasis on places where there was little data about the emissions. For example, when the study started, there was almost no publicly available information of emissions from offshore production around the world. So one of the initial priorities was to collect data for offshore production. Another similar example would be the emissions for the production and transport of liquefied natural gas. So there's a big effort across the world to collect this and policy relevant emissions data. In some cases, it's as simple as providing an initial constraint on total emissions. In other places where there's more data already available, for example, the US and Canada, the idea is to collect more granular data, perform something, for example, like what we're doing in Canada, a root cause analysis that can help us really learn what type of equipment is more prone to high emissions so that it can be replaced or not used anymore. Again, this is also extremely important, this type of lessons learned, in the context of what Christopher was describing and the EU trying to implement methane regulations. Here's one concrete example of what actionable data means. Through a set of studies, methane emissions data was collected for Mexico. An aircraft was used to collect data on the key production regions, oil and gas regions in Mexico. Then we used the European Space Agency TROPOMI satellite instrument to monitor the emissions across 2 years. What did we learn? One of the most important things we learned is that most of the production in Mexico happens offshore. And that's where the inventory would tell that the majority of emissions take place. So if you were to take the inventory and design a mitigation plan, you would likely focus your effort on the offshore production rigs in the Gulf of Mexico. What we found by measuring emissions offshore and onshore is that actually the majority of the emissions are happening in onshore production fields with relatively low production. And again, this is where the majority of the emissions happen. As a matter of fact, there's, apologies for the size, but there's a little map on the screen and there's a square highlighted in bold black colors. That square accounts for 50% of national oil and gas methane emissions in Mexico. And that's information that we were able to learn as part of the studies. So one could say that focusing action on this region would have the potential of cutting emissions in Mexico by half. Overall, we also learned that emissions are significantly higher than what official reports and inventory knows. And again, it's not just about showing the discrepancy, but identifying these emission hotspots, identifying facilities that are more prone to having high emissions, and then being able to act upon this information. Similar studies have been completed, for example, in Norway for offshore production, where we were able to collect very granular data compared to what the industry was reporting. And in terms of this, establish particular differences between the type of production and the type of facilities. Again, very important, because before this study and similar ones, for example, in the US Gulf of Mexico, there was little openly available data on emissions for offshore production. There was another study in Australia, in the Surat Basin, where through a very thorough understanding of emissions and how you attribute to the different sources, we compared to the inventory and learned about very specific sources that had a higher contribution than previously before thought to the inventory. And again, what would be the key targets to address? We're also able to compare the production, the gas production in Australia to other places where measurement-based data has been collected. And again, the main message of this plot is to show, again, this is methane intensity of percent of methane that escapes to the atmosphere. There's a very different profiles in terms of methane intensity across regions and across countries. And this matters. This is also why more granular, measurement-based, locally collected data can accelerate the early action that countries are already taking. One important lesson, I'll just move then to my final thoughts. We've also learned across studies, across the entire supply chain, that not all sites in the oil and gas supply chain are equal. In this particular simple example is what we call suprameters. So 20% of sites would account for 80% of emissions. It doesn't mean that we only care then about the 20% of sites, because we don't even know where they are. But it means that unless we understand that there's this, what statisticians would call fat tail, or disproportionate impact of a number of facilities, we really need to design mitigation and estimation of emissions in a way that it's considering this statistical nature of the emissions. We've started to see monitoring with satellites that pinpoint and detect suprameters. This is great because we know those suprameters or ultrameters need to be taken care of, but it's not all of it. Again, I think the importance is that both in terms of measurement, but also in terms of mitigation, we need to be thinking of all the emissions, not just the suprameters. Again, there's a satellite revolution with many different instruments and satellites that are starting already to provide actionable methane observations. They provide different types of data. There's cases where they can be used to detect and quantify emissions from individual point sources, like the example on the left side of the screen. So these are individual facilities in Turkmenistan, very high emitting facilities. And of course, this is very important because none of those emissions should be in place. But we can also use satellites to quantify emissions from massive regions of production, for example, the Permian Basin on the right side of the screen. Again, this is important because it can help us understand what is the magnitude of emissions, and we can use this information to track changes in emissions over time, for example, in the Permian Basin. Just some concluding thoughts also as we connect this to some of the ideas that we'll hear later from Manfredi, Giulia, and Nathan. Measurement-based data can catalyze and accelerate mitigation action under the Global Methane Pledge. Countries cannot wait for perfect data, and there's enough understanding of the mitigation actions to start with those. However, measurement-based data can support and help these countries in identifying more clearly and efficiently what those early wins could be. Empirical data is also going to be key to track emissions changes over time and understand if the targets and the ambition of the Global Methane Pledge is being reached. There's no silver bullet in terms of the different methodologies that can provide data today. And this is why one of the key things, and I think we're going to hear more from Manfredi next, is that we need to integrate data. We need the source level data, but we need to make sense also of the country level data in the inventories. We need an integrated data set of emissions to really fulfill what's needed to achieve the Global Methane Pledge. We have the approaches today to do it. They can be applied across sectors, and they can make a big difference in terms of the ambition set today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Daniel. It was very clear. And you mentioned Manfredi as the next already. I would just say that Manfredi Caltagirone leads the work of International Methane Emission Observatory. Manfredi, the floor is yours.
Many thanks, Andris and Christopher, for the invitation and your leadership on the topic, and to Daniel for setting the stage for me to tell you how, in particular, the International Methane Emission Observatory in UNEP is working together with the Climate and Clean Air Coalition as a core implementing partner of the Global Methane Pledge, and therefore supporting the ambition that the countries have shown at COP26 in collectively reducing methane emissions by 30%. Just as a short reminder, at the moment, I think there are 122 participant countries, over 70% of global GDP covered, and again, a collective methane reduction target of 30%. By 30% compared to 2020 level, and I'm sure Nathan is going to tell us all about this base 2020, and how we work on as IMEO to support this ambition again. So IMEO, as in a nutshell, supports countries and companies and in general the larger ecosystem of partners that are working on methane emission mitigation, in connecting, in focusing action, tracking progress, and connecting activities on science, on transparency, and indeed the implementation from both government and companies with data. As we have heard from Daniel just now, data have the ability, more granular, accurate data have the ability to accelerate mitigation actions, and indeed we need an accelerated actions to reach the strong objective that we have as a community, and the Global Methane Pledge countries took, and that the science tells us we need to reach to limit temperature warming to 1.5 degrees. As we have heard from Daniel, the action, the most critical sector for this in the short term is the fossil fuel sector, that should reach a reduction of over 75% in the next 90 months. And to reach such important level of reduction, we need these granular, accurate data that are and hopefully based on measurements and so empirically verified. This is exactly what IMEO does, and its main objective is to generate this public global data set of empirically verified methane emission at an increasing level of accuracy and granularity. But specifically on the in favor of the Global Methane Pledge, IMEO offers three main areas of support, if you wish, and I'm going to highlight them in a few slides in a second. But the first one is really about the IMEO science studies. Daniel has shown the different studies that we're performing, and I would like to focus in particular on one in Angola that I think is telling of the type of work that we're doing. It, for the moment, is limited to the fossil fuel sector, but starting to look also at livestock, rice cultivation, and waste. That are indeed sectors in which more action is needed, and better data would be useful. The second areas of support is going to covered by Giulia and relates to the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership 2.0, and then the third is really about the IMEO virtual training series on methane emission that is available to stakeholders. But just on to start with the science studies, it is actually undergoing now a measurement campaign in the offshore region of West Africa between Angola and Gabon. This is the first ever measurement campaign conducted for methane emissions from the oil and gas sectors in Sub-Saharan Africa. To our knowledge, it's led by DLR, the German Space Agency. And the information that the measurement that will be collected will help us understand how much methane is emitted in this region. It will help to set an emission baseline and indeed to focus action, because as we've seen from Daniel, not all facilities are created equal, and the performances in terms of emissions vary dramatically. These are type of work that we can offer to other countries as they carry.
You come in.
And I hear someone whose mic is not on mute, so I would ask him to please. Thank you. On the second point is the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership 2.0. That is a transparency initiative that IMEO runs, that was created under the Climate and Clean Air Coalition back in 2014. In its 2.0 version, it covers the full value chain of oil and gas. Currently, over 63 countries are covered in assets. There are assets in over 63 countries. And over 30% of oil and gas production, and a significant share of mid and downstream infrastructure as well. Giulia is going to tell you all about this. And then I'd like to finalize my presentation with an highlight on IMEO methane mitigation training. There is a program that we offer both virtually and in person in all 6 UN languages. It comprises of 9 modules that you can see, an overview module plus 8 more targeted modules. We already deployed it in over 18 countries in the last years, and over 300 officials from both government and NOC at local and state level. We find there is a useful opportunity for countries to and the representatives working in both government and national oil companies to increase their understanding of the dynamic associated with methane emissions and what are the practical measures that they can undertake in their different roles to minimize those emissions. I'll stop here, and with many thanks to all of you for your attention, and Andris for your leadership as usual.
Thank you, Manfredi. It was really a very good introduction. I know what IMEO is doing, but you already mentioned that on some aspect, Giulia Ferrini from International Methane Emission Observatory will go in more detail related to what IMEO is doing for implementation of Global Methane Pledge. Giulia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andris. And thanks for the invitation. It is a pleasure to be here today. So we heard it from previous speakers already. The Global Methane Pledge marks a significant contribution, has the potential to mark a significant contribution to reducing climate change. And while it covers all key emitting sectors, we know that the fastest and most cost-effective reduction opportunities are from the oil and gas sector. Now, as it's often the case, the challenge will be implementation. The pledge is non-binding. Individual countries are not assigned specific targets. Not all countries have a detailed inventory because methane is considered difficult to detect and measure. Now, if countries and companies, because at the end of the day, it's the companies that need to reduce emissions, if they do not have a good understanding of where methane emissions come from, they cannot act. One of the biggest challenges, as we heard from Daniel's presentation for the rapid emission reductions today, is the lack of data. Currently available data relies on generic emissions factors that we know in most cases dramatically underestimate real methane emissions levels. And this points to the need for direct measurements. Now, the OGMP, the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership, is the answer to this data challenge. It is a comprehensive reporting framework that focuses on direct measurements and therefore helps companies identify and mitigate the biggest emission sources. It covers all material sources of methane emissions from both operated and non-operated assets. And by asking companies to define a 2025 target and to report annually on their methane emissions, it keeps them accountable. It is more than a reporting framework. It is establishing itself as a community of practice. It provides its member companies with a unique platform for peer learning and experience sharing. It is increasingly recognized as a global MRV standard because for some countries, the Global Methane Pledge represents the first significant policy commitment on methane, either at the domestic or international level. And this pledge will need to be translated into policies and regulations, and the OGMP can serve as the basis for national MRV strategies. It is recognized in the EU methane strategy as the best existing vehicle for improving measurement measurement verification capability in the energy sector. It is the basis of the European Commission's methane regulation that was tabled at the end of 2021. And it also influenced the development of national methane regulations, such as the one that we developed for Colombia in the context of the Climate and Clean Air Coalition. The OGMP has a substantial global reach. So we know that the pledge has brought together many important players, both major consumers like the EU, Japan, and Korea, and major producers such as Iraq and Saudi Arabia. The shared goal is a targeted reduction in global emissions, even though some of the most important players haven't joined yet. And so the OGMP extends to the major emitters. So according to the IEA, 21 countries are responsible for 85% of total oil and gas emissions. Out of those 21 countries, 19 are covered by the OGMP, including also major emitting countries that are not yet Global Pledge signatories. So this means that thanks to its measurement-based approach, when integrated with other IMEO's data sources, the OGMP will help countries track progress against the Global Methane Pledge because it will have measurement-based data for assets that are in these major emitting countries. Now, let us zoom in into the heart of the OGMP. These are the 5 OGMP reporting levels. Our member companies will report from level 1 to 5 with progressively more accuracy and granularity. So if we start with level 1, that is just one single consolidated emissions number that won't tell us much about the company's actual emissions, we progressively move up to level 2 and level 3 that are based on generic emission factors. Level 2 for categories, so sources are aggregated into categories, and level 3, the reporting is made by specific sources, meaning pneumatic controllers, flare efficiency, glycol dehydrators. So we will have more information, but still relying on generic emission factors that we've seen can underestimate methane emissions. It's only when our companies will move to level 4 and 5 that we will have more confidence in the reported data. Level 4 is reporting at source level, but using direct measurements. And level 5 is the reconciliation of the level 4 bottom-up inventory with site level measurements. Our member companies will reach the gold standard when their material emissions are reported at level 4 with demonstrated efforts to move to level 5. Since this is not necessarily easy, especially for obtaining data from non-operated joint ventures, there is a specific timeline. So companies will have 3 years to reach the gold standard for operated assets and 5 years for non-operated assets. I mentioned that our companies need to define targets, and we request companies to set 2025 targets, as we need real reductions fast and no later than 2025, so that we can push the climate benefits that can be achieved by 2030. The requirement is for companies to set their own target. They can choose between an absolute or an intensity target. And as UNEP, we recommend the targets that you see bolded in the slide that we know are technically feasible to achieve. So 45% by 2025 and 60 to 75% by 2030 for talking absolute reduction, or a near zero emissions intensity. Now, in order to ensure a consistent application of the framework, we developed a series of technical guidance documents that will recommend estimation methodologies for the sources that you see in the table. So generic emission factors to report these sources at level 3, and quantification methodologies to report these sources at level 4. We're now moving to develop guidance on LNG because it is a critical source of emissions and one that is receiving a lot of international attention these days. And in addition to that, we also develop guidance on uncertainty and reconciliation, on how to reconcile source and site level measurements. We have emission templates, reporting templates, of course, and all this guidance is available even beyond the partnership as it is published on our website. Now, I realize that maybe we're a bit over time, so I'll just move very quickly on the governance. All our member companies and non-company members are represented in the steering group, that is the formal decision-making body of the OGMP 2.0 that takes decision by consensus. The work at technical level is carried out in technical task forces, and all companies have the opportunity to engage at technical level through the mirror groups that are companies only groups that meet and discuss the deliverables produced by the task forces, provide inputs and so on. So they have an opportunity to have a say in the technical guidelines that the OGMP develops, and that and this is one of the benefits that is recognized by our member companies. So these elements come directly from the companies. The benefits that they see in OGMP membership can be distinguished between credibility and transparency benefits and knowledge and experience sharing benefits. We mentioned that by developing these guidance documents, by teaming up on complex topics, by participating in our experience sharing workshops, they have the opportunity to share challenges and lessons learned on quantification technologies and on all the aspects of methane measurements. And the other bucket of benefits is credibility and transparency benefits. By joining the OGMP and by reaching the gold standard, companies can give regulators, investors, and the general public assurance that they're managing their emissions responsibly. Since the OGMP is not only companies, but also non-company members, European Commission, Environmental Defense Fund, Clean Air Task Force, the fact that the companies are challenged by external non-industry stakeholders make them progressively increase their ambition. And the companies are also represented in IMEO's advisory council that advises IMEO on various elements, and the OGMP companies are represented in this advisory council. So this is seen as another benefit. So I'll stop here. And I don't know if we have company or country representatives in the audience, but I would encourage the companies to join the OGMP and the countries to push the companies operating in the jurisdiction to join the OGMP. Thank you.
Thank you, Giulia. And I immediately pass to Nathan Borgford-Parnell. He works for Climate and Clean Air Coalition. Nathan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Andris, and thank you for the invitation, all of you, to join this conversation. Very, very happy to be here. So, as you said, my name is Nathan Borgford-Parnell. I'm the Science Affairs Coordinator and Methane Coordinator in the Climate and Clean Air Coalition. For those of you who do not know what we do in the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, or CCAC, we were founded over a decade ago. It's a voluntary coalition of primarily countries, but also intergovernmental institutions, multilateral development banks, NGOs, and private sector entities focused on integrating climate and clean air and implementing fast action measures which can achieve multiple benefits for air quality, climate, and sustainable development. Primarily focused on managing short-lived climate pollutants, of which methane is one of the most important, and certainly the most important from a global climate perspective. We've been working on methane and all SLCPs, as I said, for over a decade. We focus primarily on capacity building in countries to integrate planning around air quality and climate, implementing policies that are identified to achieve those multiple win benefits in those countries, and then supporting implementation of the fast action methane and other SLCP measures that are identified in countries. On the science side, which of course is my remit, we have a scientific advisory panel which was formed in 2012, made up of 20 scientific luminaries, many of them recognized experts in the field of methane mitigation, air pollution, air quality monitoring, and climate scenario development and implementation. We have, for example, and this is why I really like coming after the IMEO presentations, because we fit together, I think, somewhat hand in glove. The CCAC historically has not worked in the space of monitoring and MRV. We focus on the implementation, we focus on the assessment of measures, we focus on policy, and so there is really a powerful synergy that exists, particularly when it comes to supporting the implementation of the Global Methane Pledge between the Climate and Clean Air Coalition and the IMEO. But when it comes to the methane science, out of our integrated assessments that we put out every couple of years, it's always been a major emphasis of ours, identifying the measures that can achieve significant methane mitigation. For example, we conducted an assessment in the Asia Pacific region, which we published in 2019, which identified 25 measures, which if fully implemented in the region could reduce total methane emissions in the region by 45%. We were also the initiators and leads within UNEP for the 2011 Global Methane Assessment, which in many ways was at least the technical genesis of the political agreement that became the Global Methane Pledge. realize we're running short on time. I want to leave time for questions. So let me talk very quickly about what we're doing in concert and in a synergistic way with the IMEO to support countries to achieve mitigation that's consistent with the Global Methane Pledge. So first off, the CCAC is the first port of call for Global Methane Pledge countries. And within that port of call, we are developing what's called we're calling the Methane Roadmap Development Program, which builds off the decade of experience that we have in the coalition with national planning, integrated national planning around climate and clean air. And it's broken down into 5 core building blocks of national planning. Those building blocks are inventories, assessments, target setting, policy setting, rational policies to support the targets, and then MRV. Within this program, we provide examples to countries of each of those critical building blocks, good practice examples to help guide them to enhance their own systems and identify the components of those building blocks within their own countries as a baselining exercise to really understand what their existing commitments and current level of knowledge is related to methane and mitigation potentials. Building off of that, we have our sectoral hubs and our national planning hubs, which we feed GMP and our CCAC partner countries into, that have a longer longitudinal engagement and capacity building program. And we're supporting the development of methane roadmaps, and that's really translating methane commitments that are set nationally, that are identified through the roadmap program, and translates them into actual implementation, identifying implementation policy pathways and financing. MRV is a critical component of that, and it's a key part of our collaboration with IMEO. We also are supporting a great many implementation projects around the world. We have our second call for proposals out as of last week, where countries, where implementers who are interested in working with CCAC and GMP countries can look at the needs that have been assessed by our community, particularly around methane mitigation, and apply to work with our countries to mitigate their methane emissions. We're well over time, so maybe I'll stop there to leave time for Q&A.
Thank you very much. I have received the questions, and I would like you really to focus what we had from audience. We got from Matthew Williams the question that I will try to read, because also for other audience it is quite important. He asked, we are almost 1 year since the Global Methane Pledge was launched, and approaching 2 of the 10 years signatories have to reduce their emissions by 30% from a 2020 baseline. Do we know how signatory countries are doing in fulfilling their voluntary commitments? And Olivier de Bloc is asking more or less in the same direction. With all the respect to people engaged in the methane reduction objective, it seems to me that we are still measuring a lot. Where is action? There are too many initiatives on the subject. Are we losing focus? I think it's very, very pertinent questions. I know that you are perhaps at the sidelines, you provide for instruments and really transparency. But I would just to add, if you feel a bit uneasy with answering these questions, then I would say what you see as a real obstacles to achieving the Global Methane Pledge by 2030. So I think that is the essence. People are really willing to see action, really to see delivery, and seeing that there are instruments in place. Then usually is the question, what's hampering it? So perhaps I would start with, Nathan, you have been the last in speaking. Perhaps you will start with answering. Let's go different way. Nathan, you can pick what question you would like to do from the ones that have been placed in front of us.
Easy questions. Maybe I'll try to cover them all. I suppose, and I was trying to cover that second question actually with my intervention. Within UNEP, CCAC and IMEO are perfectly synergistic. There is no unnecessary overlap between our implementation and policy and assessment side and their MRV and OGMP components. So while there are a lot of initiatives out there that work on methane, at least within UNEP, we are fully harmonized and working quite efficiently. That's not always true for the entire world, but often, you know, it's not possible to be 100% efficient. On the point of where the action is, and are we doing too much monitoring, right? I mean, this is a point that I think Daniel raised as well. You can't manage a problem without measuring it, without monitoring it, right? But you can change the problem, right? And you know, and we know with a great level of confidence how to make changes that that will achieve substantial mitigation in this next decade. That will achieve the GMP target and beyond within this decade without any additional monitoring. But those will come, they will be more difficult, they will be less efficient, they will be more expensive, and we're going to miss a lot. We are missing a lot of information about methane right now, and so, you know, it is really critical that we continue to expand our monitoring capacity and tracking capacity. In terms of whether or not countries are actually taking action, I mean, in the world that we live in now, I know it's really, I mean, it's in vogue to expect every information in real time, to expect news to come in exactly as the news is happening anywhere in the world. That's not really how things work when it comes to monitoring of mitigation or monitoring of concentrations of atmospheric pollutants. There is going to be a lag time in really understanding how we're progressing. More than a year, certainly. We're confident that the partners that we're engaged with in the CCAC are committed to taking action on methane. Many of them are only establishing their policies right now and are planning and are expecting to implement them next year. So we will reap the benefit of that in the coming years. But yes, I think it's unlikely we're going to see a substantial enough change in methane emissions this year that we could attribute or not attribute to the Global Methane Pledge. It's going to take a little bit of time before we can actually prove progress from an emission standpoint.
Thank you, Nathan. Giulia, please.
Yes, hi. So I guess it's the question on if we're still measuring a lot, where is the action, right? So the point being that if we don't measure, we cannot act on the most prominent sources of emissions. So the risk is that companies will spend time and efforts reducing sources that do not account for the majority of emissions. As we've seen from Daniel, 20% of the source account for 80% of the emissions. And so the focus is not on measuring for the sake of measuring, but is on measuring to inform action and to make sure that the action is really targeting the sources that matter the most. And I agree absolutely with the statement that Daniel made. We don't need perfect data to act. And in fact, we know that technical solutions that are cost effective exist, and companies are already taking action. So the two can absolutely work in parallel.
Manfredi, I will ask you to focus on the Matthew's question. Perhaps it's the most difficult one to answer. So, yeah, can we tell how the signatories are doing, or will we be able to tell anytime how they are proceeding?
We will be able to tell, yes. Are we empirically able to see reduction in concentration? As Nathan was saying, this will take time. I remember a professor of mine describing the climate system not as a speedboat, but a super tanker. So if you want to change routes, it takes miles. If you want to slow down, it takes miles. So it's not something that can happen immediately. I think there are examples, certain evidences, at least, of action being planned and action. So we have seen the proposed regulation by the European Union for methane emission in the energy sector. We have seen the IRA in the US with a methane fee. We're expecting the US EPA to have new rules for methane emission in the oil and gas sector soon. We have seen Canada stepping up its ambition to reach a 75% reduction by 2030 in the oil and gas sector, that they need to still formalize into law, but that there isn't such ambition, and I know there is work happening to make it happen. We have seen Colombia through the CCAC and UNEP working on methane regulation. So I think there are some very promising examples on actions that are being taken at government level. But as Giulia was mentioning at some point, governments in themselves, they don't reduce emissions, right? So at the same time, we're seeing commitments by companies, not enough. We only have 85 companies under the OGMP, but the OGMP is not only a measurement framework, it is mainly a measurement framework, but it is also a way, so companies who join the OGMP and are seeking gold standard, they include the methane reduction target by 2025, so very, very short term, actionable reduction target. We suggest a 45% reduction by 2025. So to be well on path to 60-75% reduction by 2030. There is an increasing number of companies that is taking actions across the world. Certainly, we only cover 1/3 of the global oil, or a little over 1/3 of global oil and gas production, and we need to reach much higher level. But this is activities such as the one of the Global Methane Pledge then help in increasing the leadership at government level, and this trickles down to companies and those actors that effectively can reduce the emissions. So I think there are reasons to be hopeful. It's clearly not a given that the objective of the Global Methane Pledge will be reached, but there is certainly on the side of UNEP and I can confirm of the side of including the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, the interest and the motivation to do whatever we can to support the countries to reach those objectives. But I think there are some hopeful elements to build on and to accelerate. So we shouldn't be complacent, but we should recognize when things are happening and try to accelerate them. So I hope provides an answer.
Thank you. No, it was very, very strong and powerful answer. Daniel.
Yes, I mean, one thing to add quickly is, again, I don't think the amount of data collected on methane should be measured by the bulk of the volume of the data collected, but how much of that can drive change. And that's where I think a lot of what we've been hearing today and the central role of IMEO is exactly that. Not just keep producing a lot of data that is not necessarily pointing anywhere, but what are the specific pieces of information that can accelerate and catalyze action? And I think that's where some of the measures that Manfredi just mentioned in terms of initial success stories can accelerate even more.
Thank you, Daniel. So now we can move to the conclusions, and I'm very happy to give the floor to Leonie Theodoridou from the European External Action Service. Leonie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, dear Andris, and thanks to all for the very insightful exchange and comments. I will try to conclude based on what was said by the different speakers, and also bringing in some of the work that we do together with our colleagues in DGNR. What we see as necessary to arrive where we want to go to achieve and implement the Global Methane Pledge, I think I see 4 priority areas that we still need to work on. First, the political support. Here, we have a lot of responsibility as the co-conveners, and we work with the US colleagues very much to continue. We continue our diplomatic outreach to the participating countries in order to push them to put action plans together and start taking action to implement the political commitment, but also outreaching to countries that have not yet joined the pledge. And this was mentioned also by Manfredi. There are a lot of countries still that we want to have on board. The second aspect of work that we need to do, it's quite clear that we need to help and support the participating countries with technical support in order for them to identify the problem, to develop country profiles and national action plans. And here it was well demonstrated by Daniel and Manfredi and also Nathan, the importance of data-driven action to guide and make mitigation action more effective and efficient. It's evident that accuracy and granularity of data will also help in finding the superemitters, which is extremely important in order to have faster action and also reaping early wins. The third element, I think, is the company's engagement. I think this is extremely important, and it was well demonstrated by Giulia. And here, indeed, we need to work more to bring them on board, bring more companies on board, and commit to the OGMP 2.0. This is a global standard that is also being proposed in the EU regulation. Finally, an element that is extremely important is the financial firepower. We need to be able to attach financial support to this action. And there we continue our work with the BRD and EIB. Those are the two multilateral banks that have support the GMP, but also with the World Bank in order to facilitate more funds going to this work. Also, we have brought some support from philanthropy, and I think this is extremely important. So very quickly, just to reply to your question on this session, where we are. So a year after the GMP has been launched, I think, first of all, we have the GMP, which is extremely important. One of the questions that was posed is that there are a lot of different initiatives and we shouldn't lose focus. I totally agree. We shouldn't lose focus, but the GMP is all about bringing this focus together. So bringing all these work streams together, and I think we have achieved that. And this session today is a clear proof that all the different work streams coming together make sense and will help with the implementation. Where do we need to go? We need to continue our work. There is a lot to be done to achieve what we have promised to do. As EU, we are doing a lot. We are putting together our action plan, but also we are working on the regulation. So yes, the first year was also a lot of effort in putting together the foundations, the groundwork. And I think COP27 will be a critical point in time where we will meet again with all the participating countries to report on progress, demonstrate what we have been doing the past year, but also showcase good examples of countries around the world that are ready and willing and are taking action to implement the Global Methane Pledge. Over to you.
Thank you, Leonie. And for final conclusion, I give the floor to Ilaria Conti. Ilaria.
Thank you, Andris. Thank you very much. Well, I don't really know what I could add because I think it was already a very good conclusion also from Leonie. Maybe just a big thank you to all the speakers who intervened today. We heard that the challenges are complex and big, but there's also a lot of work to do. On the other hand, I see that there is a strong community of people working towards the target. I appreciated also the honesty of Manfredi and of Nathan in saying we can't be 100% efficient while coordinating and working towards this target. And also that the objectives, it's not forgiven that the objectives of the Global Methane Pledge will be met. But I see that there is a lot of momentum around these topics, and probably, as Leonie said, an action plan and keeping on working towards these objectives is really what we should keep doing. I would like to thank also you, Andris and Christopher, for organizing this timely debate. I think we definitely managed, thanks to the help of our speakers, to reply to the main questions. Where are we and where do we need to go on the Global Methane Pledge? So I think it's a very good wish in view of the COP27 happening in 2 months. Good luck to all.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I also would like to thank to Bruce. If you have seen question and answers, he also put an emphasis on UNEP. So there are many frameworks we could address this issue, but it's important that all the stakeholders involved really push for it, because it's a complicated world, and sometimes real priorities are being overwhelmed or overshadowed with tactical issues, with smaller issues, which are important, no question about it, but it should be dealt in a real strategic approach to sustainability. And methane emissions mitigation is definitely the issue that we can master. It just needs a bit of effort, and thank you for your own leadership. So thank you for everybody who joined us, and with this we close today's meeting. Thank you to everybody.